A revolution often begins with a very specific illusion, not the illusion that people are suffering. That part is usually real enough. Not the illusion that a ruling class has become arrogant, blind, or predatory. That, too, is often real. The deeper illusion comes a little later, in the moment of victory, when the palace is taken, the king is gone, the party collapses, the flag changes, and for a brief, intoxicating moment, it appears that power itself has been broken. It hasn't. The old rulers may fall quickly. The old structure may even seem to dissolve overnight, but hunger remains, armies remain, borders remain, records, taxes, local officials, weapons, debt, and fear remain. And almost immediately, the oldest political question returns. Who decides now? That is where many revolutions begin to change their character. Crowds can destroy a regime. They cannot govern a large society for very long. Someone has to organize food, law, punishment, transport, military command, and the definition of loyalty. Someone has to decide who counts as the people and who counts as an enemy of the people. Someone has to control the ministries, the arsenals, the prisons, and the printing presses. In that moment, a movement that seemed broad, moral, and collective often becomes narrower, harder, and more hierarchical than it expected. The old elite disappears. A new one is already forming. Welcome to the history of the world, where we explain how power rises, how systems endure, and how empires fall. Most revolutions do not fail because their ideals were meaningless. They fail, or rather transform, because destroying a ruling class is easier than destroying the conditions that produce ruling classes in the first place. Large societies do not stop needing coordination because a slogan promises equality. Armies do not vanish because monarchy falls. Administrations do not become unnecessary because a crowd has stormed a prison. Power can change hands dramatically without ceasing to concentrate, and because revolutions usually happen in moments of crisis, war, debt, famine, foreign pressure, internal collapse, the people most likely to dominate what comes next are rarely the broad public in all its variety. They are the organized, the armed, the disciplined, the ideologically committed, and the administratively capable. In other words, a new elite. To see this clearly, it helps to begin with the French Revolution, because it is one of the most famous examples of a revolution that promised a new political world and delivered one, but not the one it initially imagined. By the late 18th century, the French monarchy faced a familiar combination of pressures that had become unusually dangerous when combined: fiscal crisis, elite resentment, popular hardship, and a state that still looked majestic from the outside while losing its ability to govern cleanly from within. The kingdom was burdened by debt, much of it worsened by war. Taxation was unequal, privilege remained visible and deeply resented. Harvest failures and rising bread prices intensified anger among people who did not need philosophical arguments to recognize that the system was working badly for them. When Louis XVII called the Estates General in 1789, he was trying to solve a financial crisis. What he helped unleash was a crisis of legitimacy. Once the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, once Paris mobilized, once the Bastille fell, the language of politics widened rapidly. Nation, liberty, rights, citizens. The revolution at this stage could seem expansive, collective, almost open-ended. It spoke in universal terms because broad coalitions require broad language. The monarchy had become the visible symbol of injustice, and so overthrowing or weakening it appeared to mean that power itself might be redistributed. But that possibility contained its own danger. If sovereignty now belonged to the nation, then someone had to speak for the nation. If privilege was illegitimate, then some new basis of legitimacy had to replace it. And if the old system was collapsing, then decisions had to be made quickly, often violently, and under conditions of enormous uncertainty. This is the narrowing phase that revolutions repeatedly enter. They begin as coalitions against an old order and become struggles over who may rule the new one. France moved through assemblies, clubs, radicalization, war, and deepening suspicion. The revolution was soon defending itself not only against the king and the nobility, but against internal enemies, foreign invasion, hoarding, disloyalty, and ambiguity itself. Under those pressures, the Jacobins and then the Committee of Public Safety rose to extraordinary prominence. Maximilien Robespierre did not restore aristocracy. He did something more revealing. He concentrated revolutionary authority in the hands of those who claimed they alone possessed the virtue and clarity necessary to save the revolution. This was not merely hypocrisy. It was structural. A revolution under siege rewards discipline, centralization, and moral certainty. Broad participation becomes dangerous when every disagreement can be interpreted as betrayal. Emergency becomes the argument for hierarchy. The people remain sacred in theory. In practice, a much smaller group governs in their name. The Terror did not abolish political inequality. It reorganized it through committees, surveillance, tribunals, and ideological authority. The old elite had been denounced for inherited privilege. The new revolutionary elite justified itself through virtue, sacrifice, and necessity. The language changed faster than the structure. And once the revolutionary state learned to rule through emergency, it proved difficult to return to a gentler politics. Robespierre fell, then others. The Directory followed, unstable and compromised. And eventually Napoleon Bonaparte rose from the military and political wreckage, offering order, grandeur, and administrative control. The revolution that began by attacking monarchy ended in empire. At the time, this seemed to many like the restoration of stability after chaos. It was also a striking example of elite replacement. Aristocrats and court society had been displaced, but power had not dissolved into permanent popular sovereignty. It had hardened around officers, administrators, loyal officials, ambitious politicians, and eventually one man whose claim to rule rested on military success and revolutionary legitimacy, recast as imperial order. Russia would repeat this pattern in harsher form. By the early 20th century, the Romanov autocracy had become brittle. The empire was vast, unequal, and politically rigid. Industrialization had created urban concentrations of workers without creating a stable political framework for absorbing their demands. Peasants remained burdened and often resentful. The state was autocratic but not especially competent. Military defeat in war exposed weakness. The First World War then magnified every existing strain: food shortages, inflation, military collapse, administrative chaos, and elite disillusionment. The February Revolution of 1917 brought down the Tsar with surprising speed. Here again there was a brief moment in which the old order seemed simply to disintegrate. Nicholas II abdicated. Crowds filled the streets. Soldiers mutinied. The autocracy, which had seemed immovable, collapsed into near obscurity almost overnight. But the fall of the Tsar did not answer the question that matters most in revolutionary situations: who governs now? Russia's answer, briefly, was dual power. The provisional government claimed formal authority. The Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers' deputies, claimed popular legitimacy. This arrangement looked plural, even democratic in a raw and unstable way. But dual power is another phrase for unresolved sovereignty. Two centers of legitimacy cannot coexist peacefully for long when war continues. The economy fails, and armed men are waiting for direction. The Bolsheviks understood this better than many of their rivals. They were not the broadest revolutionary force at the beginning. They were one faction among many in a crowded revolutionary landscape. What distinguished them was not that they represented all Russians more authentically than others. It was that they were organized, disciplined, ideologically coherent, and willing to seize state power when others hesitated. This is a recurring revolutionary pattern. Broad uprisings create openings. Narrow organizations capture them. The October Revolution was not the moment the people collectively assumed power in any simple sense. It was the moment one highly organized faction took control of key institutions in the name of the people. That distinction is important. The Bolsheviks did not inherit a stable state. They inherited collapse, war, economic breakdown, administrative disintegration, and armed opposition made moderation structurally weak. Once civil war began, the pressure toward centralization became overwhelming. Again, this was not simply betrayal. It was a mechanism. If a revolutionary regime faces armed enemies, foreign intervention, collapsing transport, food scarcity, and internal resistance, then the people best positioned to dominate the new order will be those who can build coercive institutions quickly. In Russia, that meant the party, the security apparatus, the Red Army, and the bureaucrats who learned to translate ideological language into daily rule. The old elite of nobles, court officials, and czarist aristocracy was broken. But hierarchy did not disappear. It was rebuilt through party rank, revolutionary credentials, command over violence, and control over information. The Cheka did not resemble the Tsar's police in rhetoric. It resembled it more than the revolution had promised in function. War communism, central planning, censorship, one-party discipline, political policing. These did not emerge because equality had never mattered to anyone involved. They emerged because governing a shattered state rewarded concentration, secrecy, and force. And after Lenin, the logic intensified. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union became one of the most centralized political systems in modern history. The revolution against autocracy produced a new elite made of party officials, security chiefs, industrial administrators, military commanders, and ideological guardians. Aristocratic titles vanished. Elite rule did not. China offers a different route to a similar outcome. The Chinese Revolution cannot be understood as one sudden seizure of power. It emerged from the collapse of the Qing dynasty, the fragmentation of the republic, warlordism, foreign invasion, civil war, and profound rural inequality. By the time the Chinese Communist Party triumphed in 1949, it did not inherit a coherent national state, so much as a devastated landscape in need of political reconstruction. Its promises were broad: land reform, anti-corruption, national renewal, resistance to foreign domination, justice for the poor. And many of those promises were real in their social consequences. Landlords were attacked, property relations changed, old hierarchies were broken. The revolution mattered enormously. But once victory arrived, the old question returned again. Who decides now? The answer was not everyone. It was the party. This is what makes the Chinese case so revealing. The revolution did not restore aristocracy. It did not simply preserve the old landlord elite under a new flag. It genuinely transformed property, authority, and social structure in many regions. Yet it also created a new ruling layer through party organization, cadre hierarchy, ideological supervision, and bureaucratic command. Revolutionary legitimacy became a credential. Proximity to the party became a pathway to power. The new elite was not hereditary in the old sense, but it was clearly elite. It held decision-making authority, managed resources, directed coercion, and defined orthodoxy. This points to a deeper truth. Revolutions often destroy hereditary status and replace it with organizational status. The old elite says, "We rule because of birth, tradition, property, divine sanction, or historical right." The new elite says, "We rule because we fought, sacrificed, understood history correctly, and alone can protect the revolution from enemies." The justification changes. The structure of concentrated decision-making survives. A useful contrast here is the American Revolution, precisely because it complicates the pattern without disproving it. The American Revolution did not culminate in mass terror on the French scale or a party state on the Russian one. It is often treated as proof that revolutions can escape elite replacement, but only if one looks carelessly. The revolution against British rule did not abolish elite power in North America. It shifted it. Colonial elites replaced imperial elites. Property-owning men remained dominant in the early republic. Political participation expanded gradually and unevenly. Slavery survived. Women were excluded. Popular sovereignty existed within tight boundaries. This does not make the American Revolution unimportant or false. It makes it historically normal. Even successful revolutions usually mean recomposition of elite power, not its elimination. Why does this keep happening? Because revolutions destroy legitimacy faster than they destroy the need for institutions. Once a regime collapses, the daily burdens of governing do not pause out of respect for revolutionary hope. Armies still need command, food still needs distribution, money still needs some basis of trust, courts still need authority, borders still need guarding. Internal enemies, real or imagined, still need categorizing. Those who can perform these functions quickly become indispensable. And indispensability is the beginning of elite formation. Organization also defeats spontaneity almost every time. Crowds are powerful at the moment of rupture. They bring numbers, emotion, fearlessness, and moral force. But governing requires continuity. It rewards people who can meet regularly, issue orders, maintain records, build chains of command, and decide without consulting everyone affected. Committees, parties, armies, police, and ministries are not revolutionary accidents. They are the machinery that fills the vacuum after old legitimacy dies. Then there is crisis. Revolutions rarely occur in calm, prosperous, secure environments. They are born in war, debt, hunger, inflation, administrative collapse, or social humiliation. That means the new order is almost always under immediate pressure. And pressure favors centralization. A regime convinced it faces counter-revolution, invasion, sabotage, or famine will not usually distribute power widely for long. It will narrow authority, justify coercion, and insist that temporary emergency requires permanent discipline. Leaders promise liberty. What follows is often organization. There is also a moral dimension that matters. New elites rarely present themselves as elites. They present themselves as guardians. The Jacobin claims to defend virtue. The Bolshevik claims to defend the revolution. The party cadre claims to defend the people. Revolutionary authority often arrives wrapped in anti-elite language, which is one reason it can be hard to recognize as elite rule in real time. Power changes language faster than structure. A nobleman in silk and a commissar in plain clothes may justify themselves differently while performing remarkably similar functions, deciding, allocating, punishing, and excluding. This is why revolutions should not be reduced to betrayal narratives. It is too easy and too shallow to say that every revolution simply lies. Revolutions often transform societies profoundly. They change property systems, legal status, social mobility, political imagination, education, national identity, and the very categories through which people understand themselves. Serfdom can end. Slavery can be challenged or preserved differently. Land can be redistributed. Old ranks can disappear. Whole classes can lose power forever. That is real change. But real change is not the same as the elimination of hierarchy. The point is not that revolutions achieve nothing. The point is that they rarely eliminate concentrated power, because concentrated power is one of the recurring solutions human societies produce when faced with the problem of governing under pressure. The old elite falls because it loses legitimacy. The new elite rises because it can coordinate action, define enemies, and claim a future. People often imagine revolutions as moments when history resets. Usually they are not resets. They are transfers under extreme pressure. The symbols change, the myths change, the songs change, the language changes, the laws may change dramatically, but the need to organize force and administration returns almost immediately, and those who master that return become the next ruling layer. That is the larger pattern. Revolutions reveal that people can reject an old order dramatically, even heroically. They do not prove that large societies can permanently do without elites. More often, they show how quickly new elites emerge once the old ones are removed. The faces are different. The route to power is different. The justification is different. The concentration of authority is not. In that sense, revolutions are both more hopeful and more tragic than simple stories allow. More hopeful because they really can break ancient hierarchies and transform lives. More tragic because they so often discover that power is easier to condemn than to dissolve. People rise because they can no longer live under the old order. That is real. But once the old order breaks, the oldest political problem returns almost at once. Who decides now? And the answer is rarely everyone. It is usually those who are most organized, most armed, most connected, and most capable of convincing others that only they can save the revolution from its enemies. The palace falls, power stays. The past is quiet, but it's never done speaking. Subscribe to the history of the world, because understanding how it worked is the first step to understanding where we are now.